All right, Chapter 37, the Eisenhower Era, 1952 to 1960. So this chapter is very similar, actually, to the last chapter, and we're really talking about the aftermath of World War II and what America looks like as the only superpower, really, in the world, and how it deals with the ideology both outside the nation, with communism still, that involves the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and then the ideology internally or domestically. And we start to talk a lot about the civil rights movement, the start of the civil rights movement, and really even the start of the feminist movement, and this idea of affluence, of people actually have money now in America, and what are they doing with this money? So you really see the shift in the 1950s of our economy from one that is industry based, where you have all these factories and people working on the farms and in the factories, to one that is service based, where these are white collar jobs. People are actually working in offices now, and it was a somewhat problematic, but needed to be done because all of these jobs were going overseas in the factories because, frankly, labor was cheaper. The unions did a great job of securing rights and money for their workers the previous several decades in the United States. But eventually, these corporations looked around and saw that they could build the factories overseas, and because the unions weren't as strong in those other countries, that the labor costs were so much cheaper, so they could build the stuff and still pay the transportation costs to bring it to the United States or to Europe, and it would still be cheaper. So it was more profitable for them just to move overseas. So if you're a blue collar worker, this sucks in America. And if you're a company town, right, where the town had one or two major factories, and these factories closed down, it also sucks. So even though America is very wealthy during this time period, there's definitely some hiccups, and it was a lot of people were out of work, a lot of people moved around the country, and it took some time to shift to a more white collar service based economy. Also, we talked about this in the last chapter. Women, right? Women during World War II, for the most part, were kind of blue collar ladies. They were in the factories, and uh, they were putting together the planes and the bombers and all this other stuff. And then after the war, that stops, and they go back to their conventional historical American role as homemakers, mothers and wives. As we get back to the cult of domesticity, right, which we talked about, pretty much this whole course, and the cult of true womanhood, and how the Lowell textile mills tried to protect that back in the 1820s. You get this, we're right back to where we started, really, and really for the first time, women start to not like this role. Not when I said, I shouldn't say it that way. They actually start to push back, and the biggest proponent of this modern feminist movement is Betty Friedan, and she writes this book called The Feminine Mystique that basically just trashes this boring lifestyle that all of these women were living in the suburbs. That suburban housewifery sucked, and women didn't want to do it anymore. We get our first domestic computer. The first military computer is actually approximately World War II or so, that era. It was meant to try and calculate rocket trajectories and all the calculations that deal with rocketry. Businesses see that this is going to be useful, and so shortly after World War II, it gets modified, and so that large banks and large corporations could process all of their transactions and accounts receivable and stuff like that. The funny thing is that the picture here is a computer that you see circa 1950, and pretty much every single one of us has way more computing capability and way more power in our smartphones right now. There's another table from your book about the distribution of working women from 1900 to 2000. And you can notice right here, the total white-collar workers dramatically increases. Right, it goes from about 18% in 1900 to almost three-quarters, 73% in 2000. You can see the clerical workers, it skyrockets. You can see, remember what I said, that the manual labor, the blue-collar type jobs that women were doing early on in the 1900s, they pretty much end, right? I mean, you can see here, you go from almost 19% were farm workers to, apparently there's 3 chicks out in Kansas digging in a field somewhere, and that's about it. Another graph that shows you from your book the increase in the number or percentage of women that were working. Because remember, even though we had that little textile kind of fad in the 1820s, for the most part, women did not work outside the home. Throughout American history, they were really confined to the home. And you can see starting in about the World War II era, it skyrockets, right? The percentage goes from about 25% all the way up to almost 60%. And then it goes down a little bit. I'm guessing that's because of the recession there in 2008. Another thing that's a huge increase are TVs. Television really changes the way American society looks and acts and what they consume during this time period. And basically it goes from almost nobody having a TV in 1950 to everybody having a TV 10 years later by 1960. It was such an absolute rapid adoption of the television. It's kind of, I remember in about 2000 or so, nobody had cell phones. And then within a year, everybody had cell phones. It was an amazing universal adoption, and the United States kind of went through the same thing with TVs during the 1950s. So, what do these TV shows look like? Well, they look like the American ideal if you were white, and it was basically this suburban nuclear family. Both parents are married. They got 2 or 3 kids. They're middle class to middle upper class. They're living in the suburbs. And, these shows, they all kind of look and sound the same. The minor flaws that are in these characters are easily solved, and kind of like, ha ha ha, by the end of the episode, they've solved the problem and everybody's happy and everybody's smiling. That really was the American ideal for a huge number of people in the United States, and they tried to do this. They tried to move out to the suburbs, and they were pretty successful. And at least on the surface, a lot of their houses and their yards and their families looked like this. But bubbling under the surface, usually the dad would have been a World War II veteran. And nowadays we know with the veterans from Afghanistan and Iraq, and the massive amounts of mental health and emotional health issues that they're having, the high rates of suicide and the high rates of alcoholism and drug abuse. Well, obviously that was occurring with the World War II veterans as well, but it was kept on the down low. A lot of times their doctors were prescribing them with prescription drugs to kind of, so that they were having all these nightmares and they couldn't sleep, so then they were tired at work, so they were getting prescribed speed, basically amphetamines, from their doctors, and that's what they were getting as soldiers as well during World War II. Women, remember, they had this certain amount of independence during the 1940s, and then all of a sudden in the 1950s they find themselves with nothing better to do but clean the house and cook. And so they start to drink a lot as well and self-medicate and really kind of hate their lives. The children of this time period, they're growing up, they're the baby boomers, and they see that mom and dad are dealing with a bunch of shit. So the kids see mom and dad are hurting, and there's this immense pressure from everyone and everything and society and culture to conform, to act like everything's okay. And this is a tough environment for a kid to live in, and then you add that there's a certain amount of affluence and disposable income. By the time these kids become teenagers in the 1960s, you can see why the 1960s turns into such an explosion in the counterculture movement and the pushback, because these kids did not want to grow up to be like their parents, basically. Okay, so one of the big themes of this chapter is the commercialization of everything, and it doesn't get any bigger really than McDonald's. The first McDonald's opens in 1955 in California, and well, by now it's it's all over the world. It's a symbol of everything. Another thing with the American culture is rock and roll. Rock and roll is kind of started during the 1950s. Elvis Presley is one of the godfathers, along with Buddy Holly. It's basically just a mashup of African American blues and Southern bluegrass, and you mix them together and you get rock and roll. Part of this idea of women kind of pushing back against their traditional roles as mothers and wives is as sex symbols. And obviously during the World War II era, you had all these guys who were posting up porn everywhere in the bathrooms and the barracks and on the planes and tanks and stuff like that. And they got kind of used to looking at girly photos, and so in the 1950s comes around. There's still a market for this, and it kind of expands just beyond the frat lifestyle of the military, and you start to see magazines like Playboy, breaking into normal cultural norms, and there is no bigger sex symbol in the 1950s than Marilyn Monroe. All right, a big thing I talked about already is this idea of conformity, and critics blasted this generation of men who go back into the workforce, the domestic workforce in the 1950s, as these huge conformists. And you can see look at these pictures right here. Everybody is dressed pretty much exactly the same. The offices down here at the bottom are all in like perfect rows. The lights are perfect rows. Everybody's, I almost said computer. They didn't have computers back then. Typewriters are in perfect rows. Everything looks exactly the same. And the biggest book, or I guess piece of art that kind of talks about this pressure to conform and yet dealing with the anxiety of life itself inside is Sloan Wilson's The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. The gray flannel suit pretty much everybody in this top picture is wearing. That was the uniform, basically, of the corporate world, of these new white-collar jobs that everybody had. And, let's be honest, one of the reasons why there was such a desire to conform and a need to conform and to wear the uniforms and everybody act the same and dress the same and do the same thing, these are holdovers really from World War II. You had all of these men who were in the military, and what's the military all about? Conformity. Everybody is the same. There's strict hierarchy with the ranks and the positions, and everybody has a job to do, and you don't think too much beyond that job. You just do the job, and you'll win the war. And it worked, right? We won the war. We had this huge two-theater campaign against some of the bigger badasses in world history, and we won. And so now they get back to domestic life. They're dealing with all of their post-traumatic stress disorder stuff, and now they're getting shoved into the corporate world. And how do you survive in that? Well, you have a boss, and everybody dresses the same, and they do the same thing, and you do your job, and if you do your job, then you'll win. And so that's one of the reasons why you see everybody looking and acting the same. Notice what we've seen here in these pictures so far, though: a complete and utter lack of black people. Because the black lifestyle during the 1950s is going to be very, very different. Still very poor, very isolated, trapped in certain neighborhoods and different regions of the country, but you're starting to see a little bit of pushback. But you would just, except for perhaps a mailman or a milkman or something like that, you're never going to see a black person on TV during the 1950s. There aren't shows about black people until the 1970s. So there's still, from a cultural norm, the things that people are interested in watching and listening to, black people are still isolated. There's just a picture of the book, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. Okay, so here we go, 1952. Dwight Eisenhower here, General Eisenhower, right? Basically the leader of the European theater of World War II. He wins the presidency, and the guy on his left there is Richard Dick Nixon. He's the famous commie hunter from the McCarthyism stuff from the last chapter. He's the one who prosecuted Alger Hiss. He was very, very anti-commie, and that's how he became famous, hunting him down. So that's your president and vice president from 1952 to 1960. Just shows you how popular Eisenhower was. He really was a war hero, and aside from the Democrats' stronghold in the South, which is ironic in 2014 to say, he swept the entire country. All right, now it's important to note that the Korean War was still going on when Eisenhower becomes president. Remember, it starts in 1950 and it doesn't end until 1953. Most of the heavy fighting, the big turnovers of geography and territory had occurred in 1951, really, or the late 1950, early 1951. But they had been negotiating for 2 years, so there's still lots of soldiers dying during this time period. And this is just a photo from the book, showing the horrors of war. So let's talk about North Korea. North Korea, it's been in the news a lot lately with the whole interview and the hacking scandal. North Korea's only had 3 leaders since World War II, and they're all within the same immediate family. The first one is Kim Il-sung, 1948 to 1994. So he was by far the longest serving of the military dictators. That's what I'm going to call them. And I remember I was in high school when he died in 1994. And there was a lot of talk of, all right, finally the Korean War is going to be over. South Korea and North Korea are going to unite. At the very least, North Korea is going to open up to the West, because remember, the rest of the communist countries, pretty much throughout the world, had just fallen the previous 4 or 5 years, and so it was viewed as a timely death by Kim Il Sung. Unfortunately for the North Koreans, Kim Jong Il, his son, seized power and just the opposite. Instead of opening up North Korea to the rest of the world, he kind of isolates it even further. And you start to see even a little bit of pull away between Communist China and North Korea as Communist China becomes more Western in its pursuit of American dollars and Western wealth. He dies suddenly in 2011, and the current Kim becomes dictator, Kim Jong-un. And he's been in power since 2011, and it would appear that he hasn't the slightest clue what he's doing, and it also would appear that he is many more times as evil as his dad or grandpa. And so that's the state of where we're at. Remember what I said, that we signed an armistice in 1953, but we are still technically at war. There's never been a peace treaty with North Korea. So North Korea is still kind of at war with South Korea, the UN, the United States. Its only kind of friend is still China, although China really doesn't like North Korea. It's just kind of stuck supporting them. Oh well. All right, so we also talked a lot last chapter about Senator Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism and the Red Scare of the 1950s. And then this chapter touches on it again, especially with the Army McCarthy hearings. Remember, I told you that Joe McCarthy, he was on an absolute tear for a few years there on the HUAC, the House on Un-American Activities Committee, completely trashing people's lives, especially in Hollywood and in academia. Well, finally he starts to attack the Army and claim that different high-level members of the Army and their spouses are members of the Communist Party, and the Army just doesn't fold. They're the first group that doesn't capitulate, really. And so there are these, days and days and days, 3-4 weeks of televised hearings, and now you start to see massive amounts of Americans have TVs, so they actually watch this, and they watch it live, and they see how big of an a-hole Joseph McCarthy really is, and the tactics that he uses are horrible. It's one thing to read about stuff in the newspaper. It's another thing to watch it actually happen. And so public opinion, does a 180 on Joe McCarthy, and that's pretty much it for his career. He's formally censured by Congress, and then he drinks himself to death by the end of the 1950s. I think 56, 57, he's already dead. Okay, finally getting to black people. We talked a lot at the beginning of the course about antebellum era and what slave life was like, and then we talked during Reconstruction about the government's attempts to what to do with black people, and how that for the most part that was a failure. And in many cases, it was worse to be an African American in 1870 than it was in 1860. And it was because of those Jim Crow laws, those extremely racist laws that ensured a very cheap, almost free labor supply for plantation owners, and kept blacks from voting, from moving around, from really becoming equal Americans to whites. So these are Jim Crow laws, and they were still in existence well into the 1950s. So from 1860s to the 1950s, this is the Jim Crow era. And you start to see really during World War II this breakup a little bit. And it's almost always with the military where you start to see these segregated units of African Americans, and look, they do a great job fighting. And one group in particular, Tuskegee Airmen, they're given the job of flying fighter escort planes in places like Italy. And they have like these great records, and it really shows the rest of the military that African Americans are not inferior to white soldiers, and in fact can do these highly complicated things with extremely expensive military equipment just as good, if not better, than white people. And so you start to see the military start to break down segregation towards the end of World War II, and then especially in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Right around the same time period, you start to see professional sports start to break up as far as their boundaries and their borders. And the guy is Jackie Robinson, and he signs with the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. Shortly thereafter, you have this teenager, Emmett Till, who's actually from Chicago, and he's visiting family down in Mississippi. And apparently he whistled at a white woman, and that was it. They took him to town, they tortured him, and they killed him. And his mother, once the body is shipped back north to Chicago, his mother insisted on there being an open casket, despite the fact that his body was mutilated. And thousands of Chicagoans showed up and slowly walked past the casket. And obviously, this got a lot of press. And it's considered to be one of the things that kind of kickstarts the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement, I think it's useful to think of it in two ways. That African Americans actually begin to successfully assert their rights, and viewpoints of white people towards black people start to change. And the certain individuals who are able to harness both of that tend to be the more successful of the civil rights leaders. Rosa Parks is one of those individuals. There's this sweet old lady, and she just refuses to give up her seat in the front of the bus to a white man in Montgomery, Alabama. She gets arrested, and this begins the Montgomery bus boycott. And it was, Montgomery, Alabama had a huge black population because they're poor. Not a whole lot of them are driving, but they're actually using public transportation like the buses. And by boycotting the buses, this is devastating to transportation services there. And finally, Montgomery, Alabama capitulates, and they break down, and they desegregate within the bus, I guess you'd say. Who becomes famous besides Rosa Parks with this is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., MLK. He was still a young guy, late 20s. He had his congregation, and for whatever reason, even though he wasn't really into the civil rights movement, he kind of gets sucked into it and becomes the face until his assassination uh, 14 years later. These are just pictures, common pictures that show what the Jim Crow era in the South looked like. Theaters had multiple entrances usually, or if oftentimes the theaters were segregated themselves. There were black theaters and white theaters, and black hospitals and white hospitals. Obviously, the most well-known stuff are the schools, right, where there are black schools and white schools. But even if a theater or some other business like that was allowed black customers as well, oftentimes they had to come in different doors, like the alley door. Water fountains were segregated as well, and after a lot of schools were legally desegregated, they were still de facto segregated. In fact, meaning that black kids still were not really allowed to go into school even legally because of all of the obstacles put in place by the principal, by the school board, by the county, the city, and in some cases even the governor. Here's a picture of MLK and his wife Coretta arrested. He was arrested tons and tons of times for basically going to places that were whites only and refusing to leave when he was told to do so. And really the goal was to cause awareness to the rest of the country that this was going on, and to make to change the minds of white people around the country. That was something that Martin Luther King, I thought, was very good at. Is not only is he asserting rights on behalf of African Americans, but he's also changing the viewpoints of whites as well, because whites are still the majority, and you're really not going to effectuate any real change unless you change minds. Some of the other big highlights of the civil rights movement from this chapter. The biggest one is Brown versus Board of Education, which you will read. Really, every student should read. It's such a huge case in American history. It overturns Plessy versus Ferguson, which is so rare that the Supreme Court actually overturns one of its prior decisions, usually because of precedent. Even if the current makeup of the Supreme Court, whether Republican or Democrat, even if it doesn't like a previously decided case because of political reasons or ideological reasons, it will still follow that previous case, which makes Brown versus Board so important and so rare that it actually overturned separate but equal. That was the principle that was founded in Plessy versus Ferguson. So remember I told you that oftentimes there are many obstacles, even after Brown versus Board, to desegregating schools. So much so that the governor of Arkansas, a guy by the name of Orville Faubus, he refused to segregate or desegregate his schools, and he actually used the Arkansas National Guard, right, the state militia, to try and block these students from enrolling in a white school. And so then Eisenhower was forced to send in federal troops from other states to kind of possibly fight against the Arkansas soldiers. So you almost had like this weird little mini civil war that almost erupted here in Arkansas in 1957. Of course, Arkansas backed down, and those 9 students actually enrolled in the high school. They had to go through hell, though. I mean, what a horrible high school experience for those students to be surrounded. First of all, to be in the spotlight of the entire country, and then to be absolutely just despised and treated horribly with vile racial insults nonstop, probably your whole high school career. The Civil Rights Act of 1957. It creates a Civil Rights Commission. It's almost like a court to investigate different civil rights violations. Right around the same time, MLK forms the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Remember, he was a minister, and so he tried to organize the other black ministers in black churches so that they could more fluidly and more easily, efficiently to come together to assert black civil rights. Unrelated to MLK, but eventually he does get on board, is the sit-in movement. And it's basically a bunch of black college students. And it starts in North Carolina at a Woolworth's lunch counter where they weren't allowed to sit, and they sat there, and they get arrested. And so then they start to get more press and they get more students and they start going around. And it starts in North Carolina, but then it spreads throughout the South of black college students for the most part just going into places where they weren't allowed to, whites only places, and refusing to leave. They were sitting in. And like I said, eventually MLK kind of, embraces this. And the picture you saw a few slides ago is him getting arrested doing basically the same thing. Again, unrelated to MLK is the SNCC, or SNCC as it was pronounced, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and very similar to the SCLC. These are black college students trying to come together in many, many different colleges and really to focus their efforts in regards to indiscriminate housing, discrimination in employment, getting African Americans to actually register to vote and then to actually vote, because voter registration and actual voting among African Americans in the South was paltry. And in some cases, it was in the low single digits. These are the students. This is a very, very famous picture of the standoff at Little Rock High School in Arkansas, and you can see just the climate of these individuals, and you got the soldiers standing right here as these African American students were enrolling in school. So, speaking of racism, Operation Wetback, 1954. It's not a joke. It's an actual name for a federal operation, and it was actually done in conjunction with the Mexican government. Remember, we had the Braceros program in the 1930s and 1940s, and where they needed temporary Mexican labor. Now you have all of these whites and blacks, Americans, who want those jobs. And they're basically cheap manual labor jobs harvesting crops in the Southwest. Mexico was trying to stop the bleeding away of its population into the United States during this time period, and so you get Operation Wetback, where 1 million illegal Mexican immigrants were captured, or I guess you'd say arrested in the Southwest, and then kicked out of America back into Mexico. It's just an odd. It doesn't work because within a decade, Mexican immigration, both legal and illegal, skyrockets, and it's an issue that we're still dealing with today. It's a political hot button issue, and it was the executive order that Obama issued in either late November, I think, or maybe early December of 2014. Basically said that I think it's 5 million illegal Mexican immigrants they're not legal, but they would not be deported, and there's a path towards citizenship, which has turned out to be very controversial. Eisenhower engages in an act that is the most un-Republican ever, right? Republicans are all about small government and lessening government spending. Well, Eisenhower signs into law, and really he was the pusher of this through Congress even, of one of the largest, if not the largest, federal program of all time, $27 billion to build 42,000 miles of expressways. Expressways didn't exist; they were just highways prior to this, and so all of the major expressways in the United States were at least begun during this time period under this act. And the idea wasn't purely civil or domestic in its idea or economic. Eisenhower saw the benefits of the Autobahn in Germany and how the Germans were able to move their military so quickly, and even as he was invading Germany, and how he was able to use the German expressways so easily and so usefully. So he adapts this for American use. And so this is the time period where we thought that the Russians were going to invade at any moment, right? And so we may need to move, hundreds of thousands of men and material over the course of several thousand miles, east, west, north, and south, We have a huge country. How do we do that quickly? Expressways. And so that was, one of the major reasons why he, as a Republican president, but also as a general, remember, wanted those expressways. Now, this is a huge boon for the construction industry. Think about all the jobs that creates. Think about how this affects the trucking industry. Before this, if you wanted to move major amounts of goods, you had to use the railroads. But now, because of all this intersection and webs of expressways, 16 or 18 wheel trucks can be used, and they still to this day, right? That's the major way you get goods to and fro in America. And then the travel industry, now people can take vacations, driving vacations really around the country even. And this aids suburbanization, where you don't have to live in the city to have a job in the city. I live something like 35 miles away from my job, and I take several expressways on the way to work every day. And that's how a ton of Americans start their day, is driving around on the expressways to get to and from work. This is a picture from Operation Wetback. This is actually the Mexican-American border right here. This is Mexico, and you can see the Mexican official dragging this Mexican man back across the border, as Americans on this side are, happily contemplating Operation Wetback, apparently. All right, what's going on in the rest of the world? Well, the Soviet Union is consolidating and increasing its grip on Eastern Europe. You get the Hungarian uprising, where Hungary tries to revolt, tries to kick out the commies and become, capitalist-loving, democratic individuals. And the Soviet Union sends in the tanks. So instead of letting them do that, crushes the revolt. This really hurts the Communist Party and communist sympathizers, really, not just in the United States but in the West, because in most of the countries that went commie, they did so of their own volition, where they wanted to, right? Think Vietnam, think even to a certain extent China and some of the other Eastern European countries. They wanted it to go commie, and so they did. And so, there are a lot of people in places like France and Greece and Turkey, even small pockets in the Western Hemisphere that thought, communism is a great theory. Maybe it's better for everybody, right? Sharing is caring. Everybody will be equal. You should let them do that if they want to. And they actually liked the Soviet Union. They didn't know about all the purges, or maybe denied those purges and the slaughter of tens of millions of their population and the gulags and stuff like that. But then when they see how the Soviet Union reacts to this Hungarian uprising, it really takes away a lot of the credibility of communist sympathizers around the world. It really turns into the good people are democracy West and the bad guys are the communist East. All right, Vietnam. We're going to talk a lot about Vietnam next chapter and even the chapter after that. It really gets its roots, not even from this chapter. It should be World War II. But it starts to get a little bit of time in this chapter. And it's 1954. The United States was basically financing most of France's wars around the world. And most of France's wars during this time period were trying to retain their colonies. Remember, in the 1800s, France and Britain kind of split up the rest of the Third World between the two of them, and large parts of Africa and Asia become colonies of France. Well, those people, they see that France sucked and was weak and got its ass kicked in World War II, and so they wanted to be their own master. And so they start to revolt around the world. France is very weak, but they had this terrible decision on FDR's part. They still had a vote on the Security Council for the UN, and we still treated France like they actually mattered, that they actually had any scrap of authority or power in the world, which they didn't. And we wanted France to support West Germany and get West Germany into NATO. and because France was wary of Germany because they got invaded successfully twice in the past 20, 30 years, they didn't really want Germany into NATO. So we said, all right, we'll help finance your wars to try and keep your colonies, and in return, you vote to let West Germany in. So I guess it was a great negotiating tactic by the French. Um, but what happens is, look, the French soldiers are always terrible, and so there's this battle in Vietnam at a place called Dien Bien Phu, and they completely get their asses kicked by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong, which is basically just this, revolutionary group of native Vietnamese who want to kick out France. And they basically do. And so you get the UN steps in and says, all right, we're going to have this conference in Geneva, and we're going to split Vietnam at the 17th parallel, because it worked so good in Korea before this, 4 years before this, right? And Ho Chi Minh agrees with the promise that there's going to be Vietnam-wide elections within 2 years. So he's going to control the North, somebody else is going to control the South, and then in 2 years they're going to have an election, and whoever wins that election is going to control both. Well, we had this dictator that we back in the South called Ngo Dinh Diem, and he turns out to be a horrible dictator, pillaging and committing other atrocities against the Buddhist monks and all this other nasty stuff. And so we end up having him assassinated, and the Vietnamese people didn't like this guy because he was a complete jerk to them. And so we did some polling. We found out that Ho Chi Minh was going to win in a landslide, so we just canceled the elections. Well, Ho Chi Minh just doesn't settle for this. He invades the South, and poof, there you go. Civil war in Vietnam ensues, and unfortunately for us, we decide to get involved, and so America gets sucked into the Vietnamese War. Here's your map of Indochina, and more specifically, North and South Vietnam. Soviet Union signs the Warsaw Pact in 1955, basically as a response to NATO. Iran is a very important country in the Middle East, lots of oil, and it starts to, I don't want to say make deals with the Soviet Union, but as far as the CIA was concerned, it was getting too cozy with the Soviet Union, and so the CIA orchestrates a coup, and they get rid of the Iranian government, and they install Mohammad Reza Pahlavi as dictator. He becomes known as the Shah of Iran. He was actually very, very Western. Women didn't have to walk around with the hijab if they didn't want to, and you saw, it looked like a very westernized Middle Eastern nation for about 20 to 30 years or so. The problem is he was a dictator, and so the people were oppressed, and eventually, we're going to find out that they overthrow him, and by a bunch of fundamentalist Islamic youngsters in Iran, led by the Ayatollah, and Iran goes from being probably the most westernized Middle Eastern country to one of the most fundamentalist. And that's been a problem, obviously, the United States has been combating for the better part of the last 30, 40 years or so. Egypt, there was this mixture of, this ex-colony that didn't like its previous colonial overlords, and again this Middle Eastern kind of renaissance of Islam, and this pride of being Muslim and anti-Christian, or anti-West at least. And so Egypt nationalizes the Suez Canal in 1956. Britain and France attacked and didn't let the United States know that they were going to do this. And so the United States gets all pissed off, and so we don't help them at all. We don't give any oil or gas to Britain or France at all, and it turns into this big international debacle that makes pretty much everybody look bad. Kind of in response to these actions that are going on, the Middle East really starts to despise the West. And they start to realize that they're sitting on all this oil, and the West wants all this oil. America shifts in the 1940s from being the world's chief exporter of oil to the world's chief importer of oil. And a lot of the other European nations are in the same predicament. So in order to assert their rights and to enrich their pockets, the Middle East forms OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and where they kind of police themselves and set limits on the amount of oil that they're pulling out of the ground and trying to maximize the amount of money that they can get. And OPEC is still around to this day, still trying to manipulate world in different economic events to their enrichment. All right, round two for Ike. So the space race begins in 1957 with the Soviets launching the first satellite, Sputnik 1, into space. It was actually pretty small. It didn't do nothing but beep, but by implication, if the Soviets can launch a hunk of metal into space, that means that they can launch a nuke anywhere in America. And so America freaks out. Eisenhower establishes NASA and directs billions of dollars into missile development, both in technology and in the manufacture of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. Also pushes through Congress and signs into law the National Defense and Education Act in 1958, which gave millions and millions of dollars to high schools and colleges to really focus on the hard sciences like physics and chemistry, and also languages like Russian. And it was really to try and get America back on a technological footing that I guess it had been kind of lazy in the previous 15 years or so, because the Russians were rapidly pulling away from us in both the might of their military and in the technological advantages that they had over us. It was kind of a bad time in America. This is just a commercial that or a cartoon that shows what the Eisenhower presidency looked like to Democrats. That he was such a well-liked president, but he didn't use that political capital. He didn't use his popularity to do anything of substance, according to Democrats, including the big one, civil rights. That you had black people who were really pushing the civil rights movement in the 1950s, and Eisenhower just kind of completely ignored them. And by all accounts, Eisenhower himself was not a racist, and was in favor of a lot of these initiatives. He just didn't get involved. So Eisenhower kind of rides off in the sunset in 1960. His vice presidential partner, Richard Nixon, attempts to win in 1960. He runs against John F. Kennedy, World War II veteran, very, very rich dude from Massachusetts. And you can see that it was actually an extremely close race in the popular vote. Right, about 148,000 votes separate them, or 0.2 percentage points. And there's a couple big swing states, like Illinois is a big one back then, that really tipped the election in favor of Kennedy, and Kennedy wins the election, and you got now a Democrat in office. That's it. You get Eisenhower becoming president in 52. You get the Iranian coup where the Shah is established in 53. Stalin dies in 53. Didn't talk about that. 54, you get the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the Army McCarthy hearing, Brown versus Board. That's a big year for us, 1954. You get the Montgomery bus boycotts in 55. The Warsaw Pact signed in 55. 56, you get the Soviets crushing that Hungarian revolt. Eisenhower wins re-election. You get the Suez Crisis. 57, you get the Little Rock school desegregation crisis. You get the Civil Rights Act passed. You get the SCLC formed. You get Sputnik is launched. That was a big one too. And let's see. That's about it. All right.